Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me to this amazing symposium. So many different insights, perspectives. Really, really interesting so far. Before I begin with Sorely Visible, I'd like to bring you up to speed with some publications, recent publications of mine. Botanical Speculations was published in the autumn last year, and it's the result of a symposium organized at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It features the contributions of many amazing colleagues and artists whose practice revolves around rethinking the role plants can play in contemporary art and philosophy. Michael Marder was the invited keynote, so there's a contribution by him, and also notably the contributions of Chicago community leaders who grow plants in order to support local economies. And more recently published, Why Look at Plants, a long gestation, an edited collection of texts from different artists, scholars, and trying to map new territories in the field of critical plant studies. The main idea of the book here is to think about biopolitics and biocapitalism, and to focus on the idea of space as a defining agent in human-plant relationships. So every reader, more or less, every reader, my God, come on. Thank you, thank you. And thank you very much, Suzanne, for inviting me to this fantastic symposium. So many perspectives and different insights, so interesting. Before I begin with Sorely Visible, I'd like to bring you up to speed with some recent publications of mine. Botanical Speculations is a book generated by a symposium I organized at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It features the contributions of many amazing scholars and artists whose practice revolves around the rethinking of plant agency in art and philosophy. Michael Marder was a keynote speaker at the event, so there's an essay by him, as well as local community leaders in Chicago who grow plants in order to support local economies. And Why Look at Plants was a long gestation published earlier this year. And it's a collaborative effort involving many artists and scholars from around the world, whom I asked to grapple with the idea of biocapitalism and space. The idea of individual relationship with plants and spaces, territories, very Foucauldian inspired. It is about moving away from the notions of a species and botanical knowledge and to try and think about more localized relationships with plants. Before I begin, I just wanted to give you a note of warning. This is an unusual talk for me. Sorely Visible has a lot of history in it, a lot of Italian history, but it's necessary to understand what I want to say about the concept of roots and national identity and our limitations in the ways in which we think about plant fixity and the ways in which plants can at times trigger really important and delicate moments in the identity formations of a whole nation. So you will see that plants will come and go, and hopefully by the time they return more consistently towards the end, it'll all fall into place. So Milan, February 18th, 2017. A few minutes after midnight, flames engulfed a cluster of trees in Piazza del Duomo. Committing arson was a group of nationalist protesters who fled the scene through the semi-deserted piazza and into the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, running in the direction of the Scala. The arson was announced a day earlier on Facebook by the neo-fascist group Azione Identitaria, Identitarian Action. They described themselves as a patriotic and militant cultural movement in defense of Italian, regional, and European identity. The post, widely disseminated online by news outlets, clearly connoted the gesture as political. The aim, as they said, was not to hurt the plants, but to send a clear representational statement, a stark sign in opposition to what they call the Africanization of Italy. Milan's most common trees are deciduous planes, acers, horse chestnuts, poplars, ginkgos, and magnolias. A varied cohort of versatile and mostly non-native varieties imported and established over centuries of botanical conversation with other parts of the world. But it was palms that Azione Identitaria had a problem with. Those familiar with the hustling and bustling northern Italian mini-metropolis might be surprised to hear of palm trees in the first place. Although not indigenous to the Italian peninsula, palm trees have for long been a staple of many southern cityscapes. From Palermo to Naples and Rome, palms are a common sight on lungomare promenades and in public piazzas. But Milan's cold and dark winters badly suit the needs of these monolithic trees. Despite the climatic challenges, a few rare palms have been living in the northern metropolis for many years, most often sheltered in the high society courtyards of the city's historic center. I remember as a child peering through a corrugated gate to catch a glimpse of their fronds covered in snow. It was as close as real life can get to Fellinian cinematic magic. However, the palm trees in Piazza del Duomo are a brand new addition, part of a marketing campaign orchestrated by Starbucks, the ubiquitous American coffee company founded in Seattle at the beginning of the 1970s and today counting 26,696 locations worldwide. The 42 palms, along with a grove of 50 banana trees, were intended as a gift to the city, a celebration in occasion of the opening of their first coffee shop in the country. As it is well known, in Italy coffee is a very serious business. Sacrosanct rituals and traditions few dare to disrupt make coffee an essential pillar of Italianicity. For many years, the notion of takeaway coffee was considered heresy, and just the thought of hybridized drinks like Frappuccino gave espresso purists many caffeine-unaided sleepless nights. But times change. It took Italy years to embrace the idea of takeaway food. So only time will tell if the country will drink the Seattle experience when its much anticipated first store opens in the autumn of 2018. The exotic grove, positioned on the west side of the Piazza del Duomo, is the result of a collaboration with Italian architect and urban green expert Marco Bay. Interviewed soon after the arson, Bay vehemently defended his installation. He said the exotic grove was meant to surprise, seduce, and disorient, and the installation is not permanent. Unless an official renewal is granted by the city, the trees will be removed and relocated by the end of 2019. But so far, it seemed that the exotic grove may have failed to seduce the city as much as the architect hoped, while it certainly has not positively surprised many. The provocation may have been well planned and anticipated, but what Bay may have underestimated was the ability plants have to ignite heated debate on Italian national identity. I first learned about these events, not from the news, but over a phone call with my parents who still live in Milan, where I was born. My mother said, "They are planting palm trees in Piazza del Duomo, and bananas too. Everyone's arguing about it." I have to admit that my immediate response was of surprise. I struggled to envision how the tropical lushness of palms and bananas would come into dialogue with the elegantly cold and chiseled facade of the Gothic Duomo and the neoclassical architecture of the surrounding buildings. I immediately searched online to find an image. And there it was. Palms and bananas facing the Duomo, lined up like a silent but resilient army. Nature and culture staring at each other. The refined spiritual intricacy of pure, pale marble confronted by the raw flourishing of exotic trees. For a few moments I struggled with the aesthetic incongruity. It was at that very point that I realized something interesting was happening, and that I needed to explore in more depth my own reaction to the images. The news of tree planting in big cities has always brought me joy. But this instance made me realize that I never linger too long over questions of supposed appropriateness in relation to species and geographical locations. As an immigrant myself, I find the concept of native problematic. It is haunted by dangerous contradictions and problematic assumptions. But I realized that my initial surprise to the news wasn't necessarily linked to ecological appropriateness, but aesthetic appropriateness instead. I began to wonder if the vertical solemnity of cypresses, albeit less exuberant, may have been a better fit for the square's history and heritage. The cracks in my thinking began to show. I started to notice how my line of thinking was implicitly frameworked by outdated notions of urbanistic conservation. The feelings were conflicted. I love palm trees and bananas. They remind me of the long summers spent as a child in Calabria, the Italian irredeemable deep south with its bursting flavors, rich traditions, and seemingly insurmountable social problems. So why was I even dwelling over the appropriateness of bananas and palms outside Milan's beloved cathedral? Where was this feeling that plants may have been put in the wrong place came from? I began to question my aesthetic assumptions further. If any appropriateness of style that binds plants to architecture exists, if this appropriateness is dictated by our choice to situate plants in specific urban realities, then this aesthetic assumption must be supported by an ideology. After all, curating tree planting for a national monument is more complex than choosing trees for a trafficked urban lane. The criteria are different. History and aesthetics intertwine in the conversation established between plant and monument, in the production of complex identity paradigm emerging from a perceived continuity between nature and culture. I found the idea intriguing, but I also wondered why this had never occurred to me before. Today, everything upsets and offends someone, somewhere. And that someone's voice will be heard everywhere through social media. The polarization of politics and cultural discourses pervading the West is inviting closer, sometimes obsessive scrutiny of representational dimensions in everyday life. Appropriation, for instance, is more problematic now than it has ever been at the height of postmodernism. Similarly, new constrictions have been placed on the authorial voice. Who can say what and to whom? But perhaps, and somewhat worryingly, we all seem to be interested in purity like never before. This manifests into a pseudo-Christian sense of coherence and guilt, originality, and what I believe might be generating an overwhelmingly multiplicity of social media viewpoints that ultimately overwhelm our everyday lives. The constant shifting of cultural parameters, the schizophrenic embracing and rejecting of globalization. Let's take note, we have been asked to love the global and the local at the same time and with the same intensity. What my generation experiences today makes idealizations of childhood stronger and vivid. Suspicion that this might be true emerges when, in comparison to today, the 1980s resembles an island of peace, style, and decorum. It is in this context that a dangerous melancholia for a time that never was swells the spirits of those who, in Europe and the United States, claim to want their countries back. More than ever, we are obsessed with our roots, traditions, ancestry, as essential anchors to ever more fictitious identity emblems. With the recent increase of terrorist attacks across Europe and growing unease with seemingly uncontrollable waves of immigration, it is perhaps no surprise that nationalistic spirits are on the rise. Borders, boundaries, and perimeters thus become even more important when walls are being built, not so much to keep someone out, but to keep oneself in. Piazzas are essential historical and political constituents of most cities. In the West, more specifically, piazzas are the contemporary incarnation of the Greek agora, which functioned as a political and commercial heart of the social fabric of the city itself. In the agora, the athletic, artistic, spiritual, and political life of the city manifested in ways that fed into the formation of a shared social identity. Piazza del Duomo in Milan is no exception. It has a long history of which the city is particularly proud. Its inception dates back to the 14th century, and it is intertwined with the prestigious medieval glories of the Visconti dynasty, which ruled the city for 170 years between 1277 and 1447. Along with the Sforza, which followed, the Visconti promoted a substantial urban regeneration that pushed the arts to rival the nearby Venice and Florence. But we have to face the fact Milan has always suffered from a second city inferiority complex of sort towards other Italian capitals of culture with deeper histories and more ostentatious artistic beauty. Because of its geographical situation, however, Milan has always been a functional crossroad and strategic post. And during the last century, it also became Italy's most powerful industrial capital, gaining a reputation as one of the least culturally interesting and greyest cities in Italy. Therefore, the Duomo is its true jewel, a major historical and architectural accomplishment that characterizes the city's uniqueness in ways that simultaneously separate it from the rest of the peninsula. Because of its geographical situation and the range of northern influences it was exposed to, Milan has always fancied itself as almost French or almost German, rather than seeing itself as linked to Rome or Naples. The construction of the Duomo began in 1386. The style, the predominant style we should say, is the rayonnant Gothic. A markedly French architectural style was chosen to underline the cultural difference between Milan, Venice, and Florence. French engineers Nicolas de Bonaventure and Jean Minot were in charge of the early construction stages of a project that will eventually take 579 years to conclude. It was only terminated in 1965. For centuries, the rare pink marble of Candolia, quarried in Piemonte, was shipped to the heart of Milan aboard large barges. For this purpose, Leonardo da Vinci perfected the city's canals network, and between 1482 and 1489, he also designed a complex system of dams and locks, which further facilitated commerce for the city. Towards the end of the 16th century, as a cultural rejection of foreign influences began to emerge, Archbishop Carlo Borromeo turned towards more Renaissance-inspired aesthetics for the Duomo. The eclectic result, which elegantly combines Gothic, Romantic, Renaissance, Baroque, and Neo-Gothic, stands as a testament, however, to a persevering city capable of accomplishing impossible feats through means that victoriously bypass any cultural or technological dependency from Rome. The Italian capital, Milan, has always rivaled. Given its rich history and pronounced emancipatory cultural values, for a city that has always looked at Rome with disdain, it is perhaps no surprise that Piazza del Duomo would easily become a nevralgic point for identity-based politics. The negative sentiments revealed by the appearance of palms and banana trees are perhaps best understood in the context, but also in view of the ever-changing cultural shifts that can be mapped around the square itself. As a place for congregation, the piazza has become a point of reference for many ethnicities that since the late 1970s have arrived in Milan from North Africa, the Philippines, and Eastern Europe. It is not uncommon, especially during the evening hours, to encounter different ethnic groups spending time chatting away and drinking in the open air while listening to music. But Italy's relationship to other ethnicities has more recently become more complicated, starting from the common use of the legal, bureaucratic, and very discriminatory term extracomunitario. The term, which literally translates into extracommunitarian, that who doesn't belong to the community, was originally introduced in the 1980s to designate a subject whose legal standing does not include citizenship to the European Union. However, the term has more generally been used to designate non-white illegal immigrants from Africa and the Middle East. The term has thus become a popular tool for segregation. It's a stamp of shame, a major barrier between any possibility to integrate those who are not yet part of the community and Italians. In this context, it also is important to remember that despite the history of its famous cities, Italy was only unified in 1861. Its past as a fragmentary conglomeration of regions and city-states characterized by extremely different dialects and tradition still shows its cracks today. The cultural unification of Italy has effectively been in the hands of TV networks. The state-run Rai TV in the first instance, and then Berlusconi's Mediaset during the 1980s. The North has historically distanced itself from the South. It has since the beginning seen it as an underdeveloped and parasitic part of the country, leading to an internal system of discrimination and hate that eventually led to the emergence of the Lega Nord party. Initially ridiculed during the early 1990s, the Lega Nord has campaigned for the independence of the North, including economically powerful regions like Piemonte and Toscana, and has today also become a Eurosceptic leading voice at the government. At the recent 2018 elections, the right-wing populist party has gathered 17.4% of the vote, becoming the third largest party in Italy. Representatives of the Lega Nord have been no stranger to racist statements and other discriminatory controversies. In 2013, Cecile Cachetu Kayenge, the first black government minister of integration, was publicly likened to an orangutan by a Lega Nord senator. It was therefore not much of a surprise to find delegates of the Lega Nord protesting the palms and bananas with a banner reading "No to the Africanization of Piazza Duomo." With them also waving banana inflatables were representatives of Casa Pound, an openly neo-fascist party currently gaining popularity in Italy. Both groups have unequivocally read the presence of the exotic trees as an invitation to African immigrants, a sort of welcome statement, as they say. Italy's relationship to immigration has always been complex and very contradictory. The waves of immigration that mark the history of the country never seem to play, however, an important cultural role in the contemporary memories of those who object to the arrival of migrants. The Italian diaspora that began with its unification in 1861 has permanently relocated abroad over 25 million citizens who, in many circumstances, were ghettoized and marginalized in their destination countries. It could as well be that the fraught relationship between Italy and immigration might have its roots firmly planted in a nearly forgotten and yet all-important chapter of the country's history. Could it be that the arrival of the exotic plants in Milan's beloved piazza has unwantingly awoken uncomfortable memories of the country's short-lived but highly controversial colonialist period? In 1890, Italy conquered its first colony, Eritrea. Libya was invaded in 1911. In 1936, the conquest of Ethiopia by means of illegal chemical weapons also brought along a set of laws against the meticciato, which is the bastardization of the Italian race that at the time involved Italian soldiers and civilians in the colonies of Ethiopia and Somalia. New propagandist messages aimed at decoupling previously incited notions of colonialist and sexual conquest by casting black women as disease-ridden undesirables. Preserving the presumed purity of the Italian race entailed dissuading soldiers from entertaining sexual relationships with them or committing rape, something that previously was the norm. It is also at this time that theories on the inherent inferiority of black people were articulated in Italy by anthropologist Lidio Cipriani. In his book titled Ethnical Absurdity, the Ethiopian Empire, Cipriani overtly linked the black race to the state of subhuman animals. Meanwhile, on Italian soil, brothels became subject to stricter racial regulations, and abroad the government actively began to recruit white Italian prostitutes, referred to in the official paperwork as secretaries, to entertain soldiers in the colonies. The cultural propaganda that conditioned Italians during the 1930s was by no means an isolated case, and it can be better understood in the context of the broader racial discriminations that impacted other nations involved in much more complicated and successful colonialist efforts. Fast forward to 2018. Italy finds itself, along with Spain and Greece, at the center of a vulnerable position within the EU. As one of the closest and most accessible ports to waves of immigrants traveling to Europe in search of better futures, Italy has recently received over 100,000 immigrants per year from Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, and Nigeria. The loss of life caused by the sinking of overcrowded vessels has made headlines around the world as the EU continues to deny help or even share immigrant intake. This scenario hardly helps racial integration in a country that more or less has been defined by a sequence of political and economic crises for over 30 years. As I write, news that a vessel carrying 629 migrants has been refused safe harbor on Italian shore is gaining attention online. This is the first clear statement of the new populist government stance on immigration. The fixity of plants has often been metaphorically used to visualize the essence of human fixity, to truly belong to one or another continent or land. To set roots in one place means to grow and develop a coherent life based on a commitment to one's own local customs and ideals. However, these rhetorical notions of fixity couldn't be more fictitious when applied to the adaptability and versatility of living plants. How they can sometimes very easily colonize new geographical territories, often adapting to less than congenial climatic conditions. Plants are never static. They travel. In fact, instead of focusing on the fixity of the individual, concentrating on plants' ability to disperse and migrate might allow us to let go of erroneously naturalized conceptions that only really exist in the markedly human fear for the other. While far-right innuendos of, quote, let's bring in the monkeys, end quote, or now the Africanization of Milan is complete, illegal immigrants will finally feel at home, end quote, dominate the news, a left-wing group named Sentinelli di Milano organized a humorous counter-protest on Palm Sunday. They invited citizens to bring with them a plant, a fruit, or a vegetable of any form, color, or provenance to say, we support diversity. Let's be clear. Never before, in Italian history, botanical species have functioned as such charged political catalysts. However, as it happens, phytohistories never are linear, and more often than not, their entanglements with transhistorical human non-human networks produce ambiguously polysemic opportunities. The original title of Marco Bay's Palms and Bananas installation was Milanese Tropical Forest. This was revised by the city government to the current Milanese Garden between 19th and 20th century. The request for a title change is perhaps indicative of an initial sense of unease with the overtly tropical connotation of the project. Instead, the final title justifies, or perhaps dilutes, Bay's cultural operation as a reference or restaging of the palm trees that once stood in Piazza del Duomo during the second half of the 19th century. Here's photographic evidence. It wasn't the first time palm trees have come to the piazza. The ambiguity linked to the title of the installation is further problematized by the complex histories of the species in question. Seemingly naturalized roots, cultural identities can be the result of rather short but intensely exposed representational constructions. Bananas, for instance, have only become popular in Europe since the 1870s. The plant is not native to Africa, as many might believe, and its long history of domestication spans many ethnic groups from around the world. It is believed that farmers in Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia first began to select and cultivate banana trees since 600 BCE. Subsequently, Indian traders traveling through Malaysia brought the plant to India, where it was collected by Alexander the Great in 327 BCE, who took it back with him to the Western world. Meanwhile, bananas spread to southern regions of China, where different varieties have been selected since 200 BCE, and around 650, Muslim traders imported the plant to Africa and crossbred two varieties, Musa acuminata and Musa balbisiana. During the Renaissance, banana trees traveled to Italy for ornamental purposes, but were the exclusive possession of the extremely rich. Meanwhile, Portuguese sailors discovered bananas in West Africa and established the first banana plantations in the Canary Islands. Thereafter, bananas were exported to Latin America and the Caribbean. The Cavendish variety, which is most commonly available in today's supermarkets, is a crossbred variety engineered in the Duke of Devonshire's Victorian hothouse, not Africa. The plant is currently grown across the globe in over 150 countries, from the Caribbean to Central and South America to West Africa, Philippines, and Australia. Since the current edible varieties are seedless cultivars, propagation of plants is only possible through side shoots and roots. This technically makes bananas a transhistorical living sedimentation of many different peoples and geographies, not the plant of a single country or a single peoples. Despite its rich and deep history, its unequivocal connection to Africa in the eyes of contemporary Italians might spring from a closer past. Bananas consumed in Italy between the 1930s and the 1950s came from the colonial Italian-Somalian town of Gennale, which vastly strengthened the associated racial and geographical connotation that characterizes the fruit in today's imagery. The distinctive straight and unbranched morphology that characterizes over 2,600 species of palms around the world is today universally recognized as a marketing emblem for the leisure time paradise. Palms thrive in tropical and subtropical climate around the world. Therefore, different species can be found in South Asia, South America, northwest Mexico, and the Arabian Peninsula. The history of their domestication does not begin in Africa either, as records show that the early cultivation of palms took place in the Middle East 5,000 years ago. From palm oil to dates, coconut, and raffia, for rope making, palms have provided and still provide substantial sustenance and resources. Only two species of palms indigenous to the Mediterranean exist: Camerops humilis, and Phoenix theophrasti. Other varieties, like Phoenix dactylifera, came to Italy during the 19th century. Between the second half of the 18th and 19th centuries, a growth in interest for exotic plants led to the establishment of climatization gardens in Tuscany, where more varieties of palms can be studied. The Orientalist and primitivist waves that characterized the 19th century and the Italian colonial spell of the 1930s and 40s both reignited the interest for the cultivation and dissemination of palms in Italy. It is at this time that colonialist ambitions established a more visible cultural connection between palm trees and Africa in the Italian imagery. The more frequent extraction of palm oil from Elais guineensis, a species of palm native to West and Southwest Africa, further popularized the plant as the emblem of an exotic to conquer, subjugate, and exploit. But more than that of banana trees, palms' history is also defined by the symbolic values of immortality, triumph, peace, victory, and spirituality. Palms are mentioned more than 30 times in the Bible and 22 times in the Quran. In this case, too, the palm is a transhistorical living sedimentation of many peoples and geographical realities, rather than a specific anchor to a defined notion of national identity. However, it is likely that the right-wing protesters' conception of palms might conflate multiple alterities. Not only, in their words, the trees have been reduced to a symbolization of the African continent and its people, but the widespread presence of palms in the southern regions from Rome to Palermo make it the emblem of what right-wing protesters also perceive as an untimely, ultimately inferior Italy they would rather separate from. Pejorative comparisons between Italy's South and Africa have been a frequent recurrent through the rise of power of the Lega Nord, and have been frequently used in order to support their case for secession. At a parliament meeting in 2013, a legal representative of the Lega Nord stated, quote, "I believe that Garibaldi has united Italy while at the same time dividing Africa. There are places in our country that resemble Africa where the mentality and economic reality don't match the productivity of the North." End quote. In observing how specific plant species have become a catalyst for racial tensions in the country, it is also important to consider another factor: climate change. It is now appearing more and more clear that the fixity of plants as species incarnating the natural essence of a special geographical area is the result of a persistent myopic perspective on plant evolution and climatic shifts. Plants infiltrate new, suitable territories at every opportunity, utterly disrespecting legal or historical borders. Recent research led by Dr. David Greenwood at Brandon University in Canada has, for instance, expanded our understanding of the range and evolutionary speed of palms. 65 million years of old fossils of palm leaves found in Alberta demonstrate how different climatic conditions in the Paleocene enabled palms to thrive much further north than originally known. More than a year after the arrival, the palms and the bananas of Piazza del Duomo are thriving, and the bananas are now bearing fruit. The controversy has quieted down, and Chiquita, a well-known Swiss producer and distributor of bananas, has seized the opportunity to promote the consumption of the fruit through performances and initiatives dotting the square. It remains unclear if the trees will be allowed to remain in place after the end of 2019, when, according to the terms of the original commission, they should be removed. Will public debate reignite once more at that time? Will the right-wing protester joyfully exult? Regardless, this alleged misplacement of plant species caused an important short-circuiting of intertwined histories of peoples and plants. It has demonstrated how important plants can be in the politics of identity construction and how they operate in the context of important conceptions like native, other, and notions of culturally and aesthetically appropriateness. But most importantly, instances such as these, in which plants become sorely visible, reveal important chains of inferences that, if untangled, might shed light on our everyday relationship with plants, other peoples, cultures, and our past and future histories. Thank you very much.